What is the Book of Acts? Is it a reliable history of the early church and the life of the Apostle Paul? Or is it rather a late, largely fictional retelling of these events? It is safe to say that modern New Testament scholarship strongly favors this latter option. But what if there is compelling evidence telling in favor of the historical reliability of Acts? And if so, what are the ramifications of this evidence for the Christian faith and for Christian apologetics? This video will explore these questions, arguing that there is excellent evidence for the reliability of the book of Acts, and that this fact serves a critical role in making the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Who wrote the book of Acts? Uncontroversially, the third gospel and the book of Acts probably share the same author, given the similarities in style and vocabulary between them. Gregory Boyd observes, "It is almost beyond doubt that the author of Acts is the same as the author of the third gospel. His opening reference to his former book, and his renaming of his primary reader as Theophilus, is itself almost enough to establish as much. The close similarity and style of both works also points to the same conclusion, and the overall distinctive outlook of the two works are essentially the same. Both works, for example, share a distinctive universal scope, a sympathetic treatment of women, a concern for Gentiles, a similar apologetic tendency, and an identical Christology. A host of other more incidental considerations also indicate that one author wrote the two works as a two-volume set. Both the third gospel and Acts have traditionally been attributed to Luke, a companion of the Apostle Paul. If this traditional answer is correct, then the book of Acts becomes a highly valuable source of information, since this means that the author is an eyewitness to much of what he reports. But is the traditional answer correct? In my video, Who Wrote the Gospels? The Case for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I have already surveyed extensive evidence for the Lucan authorship of the third gospel based upon early manuscripts, internal clues, and the unanimous voice of the early church. Since the third gospel and the book of Acts have the same author, the evidence which I put forward for the Lucan authorship of the third gospel in that video equally supports the Lucan authorship of the book of Acts. As Boyd helpfully summarizes, as with all the Gospels, the traditional authorship of Acts is unanimously attested to in the early church. Luke, the beloved physician and companion of Paul, composed Acts as the second part of his two-volume work. The first surviving explicit references to Luke as the author of Acts come from the 2nd century. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen all attest to his authorship, and they do so in incidental ways, showing that in their day the point needed no argumentation. The antiquity and unanimity of this witness must impress us. So must the fact that there is no discernible ulterior motive on the part of the tradition for naming Luke as the author. He certainly plays no prominent authoritative role in the early church. But more than this, there are good reasons to believe that Luke authored the book of Acts from within Acts itself, notably the we passages. At 3 different times within his narrative, the author of Acts seemingly includes himself within these parts of his narrative by employing the second-person plural pronoun we. At least on its face, this lends considerable credibility to the notion that the author of Acts was an eyewitness to many of the events within his narrative. As Boyd highlights, the most impressive indication of his companionship with Paul is the incidental way the author switches from the usual first-person singular to the first-person plural at certain junctures in his narrative. Such switches are too subtle and infrequent to constitute a fictitious apologetic ploy or be seen as mere literary convention, and attempts to postulate an earlier written source to explain them are speculative and create unnecessary theoretical sources, a move, as we have seen, that always weakens any hypothesis. Nor is there a shred of literary evidence to support such a view. And Harold Riley adds, The we sections are clearly meant to imply the presence of one of Paul's companions. Of the possible companions, some are excluded by the reference to them in Acts, some because they are known to have joined him too late to qualify. Two persons are possible, Titus and Luke. Neither of them is mentioned by name in Acts, and the suggestion that both names refer to the same person is excluded by 2 Timothy 4:10. Of the two possible companions, there is no reason for preferring Titus to Luke in face of the unanimous tradition that the author was Luke. It is also worth pointing out that Luke is traditionally thought to be a physician, and that there is a fair amount of medical terminology used throughout his gospel. W.K. Hobart popularized this as an argument for Luke's authorship of Acts in 1882. But H.J. Cadbury offered a famous critique, showing that many of these same terms also showed up in ancient sources which are unquestionably not authored by physicians. So while the medical language in Luke cannot be used as a decisive argument for Acts having been authored by a physician, it is at least consistent with this idea. Jefferson White puts it best when he says, "While it can be said that Luke and Acts contain more medical terms than any other book of the New Testament, this does not, by itself, prove that a doctor wrote Luke and Acts. On the other hand, if a doctor wrote these two books, it would be surprising if these terms were not used." Taken together, the evidence for the Lucan authorship of the third gospel, the unanimity of church tradition, and the internal evidence from within Acts itself, all points very convincingly to Luke, the companion of Paul, as the author of Luke-Acts. There is, however, one serious objection to the idea that Luke could have been the author of Luke-Acts, namely that Luke-Acts is just too late to have been authored by Luke. Many scholars are now maintaining that Luke-Acts wasn't written until the middle of the 2nd century, but Luke the physician would have been dead by then, and so he could not have been the author. There are two main reasons for dating Luke-Acts this late. The first is that the two-volume work shows dependence upon the work of the Jewish historian Josephus, and the second is that Luke-Acts is not mentioned or clearly quoted by any church father until the middle of the 2nd century. We shall examine both of these arguments in some detail, and I will argue that neither is successful in justifying the late date for Luke-Acts. After this, we shall briefly canvass some evidence suggesting an early date for Luke-Acts prior to 70 AD. The idea that Luke-Acts is dependent upon the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus was fairly popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. However, the idea waned in popularity throughout the 20th century to the point that it was virtually dead just a few decades ago. However, this idea is making a comeback within scholarship and growing in popularity. And no one has done more to revive this idea's popularity than Josephus scholar Steve Mason in his 1992 book, Josephus and the New Testament. Mason's argument is essentially that there are too many points of similarity between Luke-Acts and Josephus to plausibly be construed as mere coincidence. He argues as follows: "I cannot prove beyond doubt that Luke knew the writings of Josephus. If he did not, however, we have a nearly incredible series of coincidences which require that Luke knew something that closely approximated Josephus's narrative in several distinct ways. This source, or these sources, spoke of Agrippa's death after his robes shone, the extramarital affairs of both Felix and Agrippa II, the harshness of the Sadducees towards Christianity, the census under Quirinius as a watershed event in Palestine, Judas the Galilean as an arch-rebel at the time of the census, Judah Theudas and the unnamed Egyptian as three rebels in the Jerusalem area, worthy of special mention among a host of others, Theudas and Judas in the same piece of narrative, Judaism as a philosophical system, the Pharisees and Sadducees as philosophical schools, and the Pharisees as the most precise of the schools. We know of no other work that even remotely approximated Josephus's presentation on such a wide range of issues. I find it easier to believe that Luke knew something of Josephus's work than that he independently arrived at these points of agreement. Nevertheless, further study may provide alternatives. For the most part, these coincidences noted by Mason are fairly nonspecific generalities, which are easy to explain given that both Josephus and the author of Luke-Acts were well acquainted with the culture and politics of the mid-first century. There are only two places where the narratives of Luke-Acts and Josephus connect: the census under Quirinius and the mention of the same three rebel leaders who were active in the years preceding the First Jewish-Roman War between 66 and 73 AD. The first of these is an unlikely candidate for establishing Luke-Acts dependence upon Josephus, given that the two accounts are incompatible with one another. In Luke's Gospel, the census occurs fully 10 years before it does in Josephus. This discrepancy tells against the idea that Luke used Josephus as a source. As Jonathan Bernier argues, we need not determine which of these reports might be accurate and which might be inaccurate. For our purposes, it is sufficient to note that to the extent that Luke's account is fundamentally irreconcilable with Josephus's, we have reason to doubt that either one stands as a source for the other. And Colin Hemer adds, the theory of Lucan dependence on Josephus has had in its day a certain vogue, and has been used as a major argument for the late dating of Luke-Acts. But where the two writers touch, they often conflict. This scarcely favors the first hypothesis, unless we assume that Luke was singularly careless or prejudiced to contradict his source gratuitously. In other contexts, scholars are widely cautious to posit knowledge or dependence, even where verbal resemblances exist. Regarding both authors mentioning Judas the Galilean, Theudas, and the Egyptian, Mason's argument depends wholly upon Luke-Acts and Josephus naming these individuals in exactly the same way. But such an argument is terribly weak just on its face. Even if we assume a literary explanation for the sake of argument, there is no obvious reason to prefer the idea that Luke is drawing from Josephus than that Josephus is drawing from Luke, or that both are drawing from a common source, which has since been lost. Furthermore, it is more than clear that these three individuals could be identified by the same titles without any appeal to literary dependence whatsoever. It is just as likely that these individuals were known by these names in the oral traditions which were familiar to both Luke and Josephus. Indeed, one might argue that some famous discrepancies between the two favor this hypothesis. As Bernier points out, much as with the case of the Quirinius data, the most obvious barrier to affirming either that Luke is dependent upon Josephus or Josephus upon Luke comes from the famous contradiction between the two authors. In Acts 5:36-37, Luke's Gamaliel I places Theudas' revolt before that of Judas the Galilean, but Josephus reports that Judas's revolt predated Theudas's by about 40 years. Suspicion of independence only increases when one asks a crucial empirical question: why the Egyptian? For the sake of argument, if we suppose Josephus's independence or priority, why did he single out the Egyptian? Why, if there were innumerable rebel figures, did Josephus choose a figure whose name he did not know? The most intelligible answer is that the Egyptians' operations were remembered as in some way significant. These operations loomed large in the memories of those who lived through the period, even though his name did not. Josephus singled out this figure because his sources, orally written, did so before him. He may have selected Judas and Theudas for much the same reason. This raises the possibility that Luke, too, emphasizes these three figures on the basis of his own sources. Indeed, given their precise combination of similarities and differences, it is likely that both Luke and Josephus drew upon different sources from the decades leading up to the Jewish War that nonetheless emphasized Judas, Theudas, and the Egyptian. Certainly, the crucial differences between Luke and Josephus in the treatment of these figures should make us wary of positing that either is directly dependent upon the other. Such wariness is likewise well warranted regarding the relationship between Luke, Acts, and Josephus more generally. Cumulatively, while we cannot exclude Lucan knowledge of Josephus, neither is such knowledge more than a possibility. The relationship between Luke, Acts, and Josephus's writings should be considered non-probative for establishing the compositional date of the former. I think that this last statement by Bernier is actually too generous. I think that we have citations from the early patristics which are quoting from Luke's Gospel, thereby placing Luke Acts well into the 1st century. It is widely believed that Luke's Gospel is never clearly quoted by the patristics until the middle of the 2nd century, and that this silence of the early patristics with respect to Luke warrants a 2nd century date for the Gospel. This would make both the 3rd Gospel and Acts too late to have been written by Luke the physician. Arthur Bellinzoni sums up the current scholarly opinion when it comes to the patristic usage of Luke, saying, "In examining the apostolic fathers, it was found that there was very little use of the Lucan Gospel. It is only as we approach the later apostolic fathers, toward the middle of the 2nd century, specifically 2nd Clement, and the later writing included in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, that it appears likely that there was at least some knowledge in use of the Gospel of Luke. There was apparently little or no significant use of the Gospel of Luke before 150. Popular though this sentiment may be, it is simply not sustainable in light of recent advances in the study of the patristics. At least 2 very early church fathers quote Luke's Gospel. Ignatius of Antioch, in his letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, quotes Jesus as saying, "Take hold of me, touch me, and see that I am not a bodiless ghost." This sentence is a verbatim match for Luke 24:39, and it is the only known source for this saying of Christ, making Luke's Gospel the most probable source. And since Ignatius was martyred in 110 AD, Luke Acts must date to before this time. As Robert McEwen explains,
does Luke know Josephus? Well, I think really the jury is still out on that. In Mark's very good article where he takes on Matthean posterity, he does mention in a footnote that not only is there evidence that that Ignatius knew Matthew, but there's also evidence in 2 passages that Ignatius knew Luke as well. So since Ignatius wrote in AD 110, as most people believe, there's not a lot of time for Luke to be very far in the 2nd century, and I don't think there's room for the 2nd century as well. By the way, Luke is also quoted by in 1 Timothy 5:18, where it says, "The Scripture says the laborer deserves his wages." So it seems like Luke is being quoted as Scripture, because we don't know any other besides those 2, early on that use those exact same words.
But not only does Ignatius quote from Luke, I would argue that Papias of Hierapolis does as well. In my video on gospel authorship, I argued that Eusebius's source for his 4-fold gospel tradition, preserved in Ecclesiastical History 324, 5-13, is most probably Papias, which would prove that Papias knew about Luke's gospel. But even if one does not find that case persuasive, there is another reason to believe that Papias knew Luke's gospel, namely that he directly quotes from it in a little-known fragment preserved in Andrew of Caesarea's 5th or 6th century commentary on the book of Revelation. At one point, Andrew quotes Papias as quoting Jesus, saying, "I saw Satan fallen from heaven like a lightning bolt." This is a match for Luke 10:18, suggesting that Papias was familiar with Luke's gospel. As Charles Hill argues, this saying of Christ's is recorded only in Luke's gospel. While it is possible to suggest that there was an unknown source used by Luke still circulating in Asia Minor at this time, The simplest explanation, and the one which requires the least dependence on supposition, is that Papias here reflects a familiarity with Luke's Gospel. All this points to the conclusion that Papias in Hierapolis, writing probably in the 120s, knew all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This would make him the earliest person we can name who knew them all, so far. While Hill dates Papias to the 120s AD, which is still far too early to date Luke-Acts to the mid-2nd century, there are good reasons to think that Papias was writing even earlier, perhaps as early as the 90s AD. For one thing, Eusebius discusses Papias in the 3rd book of his ecclesiastical history, but this work seems to be limited to the time prior to the close of Emperor Trajan's reign, meaning that Papias' writings would need to be written within that time period. As Robert Yarborough argues, Eusebius classes Papias with the young Polycarp, Ignatius, and even Clement. That is, with those who were the immediate successors to the apostles. Nowhere in Book 3 of Eusebius' history, in which Papias is treated, does he discuss matters later than Trajan's reign. In fact, Book 4 opens with the 12th year of Trajan's reign. Without question, Papias is viewed as flourishing before 109. Yarborough further points out that Eusebius offers a list of early Christians, seemingly in chronological order, which places Papias after the Apostle John, but prior to Polycarp or Ignatius, suggesting that Papias was older than both of them. As he explains, Eusebius' Chronicon furnishes a second and related clue for dating Papias. Eusebius places the aged Apostle John, Papias, Polycarp, and Ignatius, in that order, in the same entry. Next to this entry, Eusebius has, as part of his running table of dates, the year 100. With this entry, he concludes his treatment of the 1st century. Unquestionably, Eusebius here links Papias with the Apostle John as a church leader at the close of the 1st century and as a contemporary of Ignatius and the young Polycarp. And as a final point, it is noteworthy that neither Irenaeus nor Eusebius ever cite Papias in their criticisms of Gnosticism, despite a strong propensity for both of them to do this when prominent church figures spoke out against Gnosticism. This suggests that Papias was writing prior to the prominence of Gnosticism during the early and mid-2nd century, suggesting a 1st century date for his writings. Again, Yarborough says, another clue in dating Papias is that neither Irenaeus nor Eusebius adduces Papias as an anti-Gnostic witness. Now, when Irenaeus is able to cite earlier authorities, especially biblical writers, against his ideological opponents, he gladly does so. Eusebius' penchant for quoting copious portions of earlier works is well known. Yet for all the vehement opposition of these two against the early Gnostics, it appears that neither turns to Papias for support in his arguments. The most obvious explanation for this is that Papias said nothing about the Gnostics, whose teachings Irenaeus and Eusebius were trying to refute. That is, Papias wrote far too early for such Gnostics to be of concern. All of these considerations push me towards dating Papias' writings to sometime in the 90s AD. And since Papias appears to know Luke's Gospel, this entails that Luke-Acts was written sometime in the 1st century AD, early enough for Luke the physician to have been the author. So much for the case for the late date for the book of Acts. But aside from the evidence we have already canvassed for a 1st century date, there are considerations which favor a date prior to AD 70. Specifically, why is there no mention of the death of Paul around 64 AD, or of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 in the book of Acts? Given that the happenings at Jerusalem are of interest to the author of Acts, and that the ministry and sufferings of Paul form the central plot for Acts, had the author of Acts been aware of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, or of the execution of Paul in 64 AD, it seems unlikely that he would have failed to mention these events, so one straightforward explanation for why he does not mention them is that these events had not yet happened when he wrote Acts. As Boyd argues, one fact that strongly impressed a number of scholars is that the narrative of Acts breaks off abruptly with the trial of Paul at Rome. Given the centrality of Paul to this work, this is difficult to explain except on the supposition that Paul had not yet been martyred when Luke wrote his narrative. It is sometimes responded that such a happy ending fits Luke's apologetic purposes, but it is certainly difficult to suppose that Theophilus, or any later reader, would have been very impressed with Luke's intentional glossing over the obvious truth that Paul, along with a vast multitude of believers, were mercilessly martyred under Nero. Another response has been to argue that while Luke doesn't end his work with Paul's martyrdom, the prediction of Acts 20:25 shows that he is nevertheless aware of it. But it is not at all clear that 2025 is a prediction of Paul's death, or just an indication of Paul's missionary resolution. And even if it were the former, this does nothing to explain why Luke would omit the fulfillment of this prophecy in his own work. The less frequent response is that the original ending of Luke has been lost, or that Luke had intended a third volume, are even weaker. In reality, they only serve to demonstrate how desperately some explanation for Acts' abrupt ending is called for. Related to this point is the way that the author of Acts speaks of certain individuals as though they are still alive. For example, he speaks about the Emperor Nero by his title Caesar, and he speaks about him in a more or less positive way, as though he is afraid to speak ill of someone who is still in authority. This very respectful way of speaking about Nero is all the more surprising when one considers that Nero was the one who ultimately had Paul executed. Given the author's evident respect for the Apostle Paul, it is curious that he should treat the man who executed him with such respect unless Nero had not yet executed Paul at the time the Acts was composed. As Martin Moss observes, references to Nero in Acts appear to indicate that he is still alive. Though he was universally damned after his death and spoken of as Nero by Pliny the Elder, Josephus, Martial, Juvenal, Tacitus, Suetonius, and others, rather than as Caesar, Acts had a habit of referring to Nero vividly, politely, hopefully, and deferentially as Caesar. This would have been proper and natural if Nero were still alive, and unlikely if he were dead and universally vilified. It would incidentally indicate in the present reign. After his death, we would expect him to be called by name at least once. As another example, consider the way the author of Acts casually refers to Lucius Annaeus Gallio as just Gallio in Acts 18. He seems to assume that his audience will be familiar with this rather obscure figure, something which is less surprising if Gallio were someone within living memory when Acts was composed. It's much less likely that the author would have felt free to reference Gallio in this way without further explanation to the reader if he was writing a long time after Gallio's tenure. Again, Moss says, Gallio is referred to as though readily identifiable to Luke's readers. He was, in fact, a relatively obscure elder brother to Seneca, the eminent Stoic and statesman who fell from favor in 62 and committed suicide 3 years later, apparently followed by Gallio himself. In Rome of the early 60s, while Seneca was prominent, Gallio, referred to familiarly, would have been easily understood, but it is most unlikely that Lucius Annaeus Gallio, dim proconsul of a quiet province in Greece for a year under Claudius, would have been known to Christians in places like Antioch or Ephesus during the Flavian decades, let alone familiarly as Gallio. We have, then, numerous good reasons for thinking that Luke the physician and companion of Paul was indeed the author of the book of Acts. Attempts to date Acts into the middle of the 2nd century are based upon the thinnest of arguments and are simply overwhelmed by the strong evidence which we have surveyed for an early date. All in all, we have every reason to believe that the author of Acts is in a good position to know what he's talking about. As Moss concludes, to the best of my knowledge, the skeptics have never attempted to do any more than dispute whether the arguments adduced in favor of the Lucan authorship of Acts actually prove what is claimed for them. There are but few, at least since 1914, who have attempted to show that St. Luke could not have been the author, and none at all that I am aware of who have argued in favor of any other identifiable individual. The onus of disproof, therefore, lies with the skeptics, but to the best of my knowledge, this has never been undertaken. So, having defended the ideas that Luke really did author the book of Acts, and that Acts dates to early enough to have been written by Luke, we can now explore the evidence which suggests that Luke was being truthful. There is so much evidence here, and I cannot possibly cover it all, but I will present some of the more interesting examples within the various categories of evidence for the reliability of Acts and refer interested viewers to the sources I cite for more details. One example of the astonishing accuracy of Acts regards the application of the various official titles to the individuals who appear within or are mentioned within the narrative. It can be easy for modern readers to miss the significance of this accuracy, but in an age where there was no internet, where official titles were constantly changing, and where other historians often botched these details, Luke's consistent accuracy is remarkable. As Boyd states, the status of provinces, along with the titles of their officiaries, changed with some regularity. We cannot, therefore, help but be impressed when Luke drops a host of names and titles within his record, and almost without exception, indisputably gets them right. In Acts, the governors of senatorial provinces in Cyprus are accurately termed proconsuls, whereas those over imperial provinces, such as Syria and Judea, are correctly termed hegemon. Relatedly, Herod is not called king of Galilee, but tetrarch, while other members of the Herod family, Agrippa I and II, are properly titled king. Similarly, Luke notes quite incidentally that Philippi is a Roman colony, whose magistrates are therefore called praetors, and whose officers are called lictors or sergeants. In Thessalonica, however, the chief authorities are called politarchs, a term not found elsewhere in extant literature, but 6 times confirmed by archaeological findings in Thessalonica. Similarly, Luke has a strong command of the geography of the places he describes, accurately relaying the amount of time it would take to travel from one location to another, the direction of travel, and the sort of terrain that one was likely to encounter. This suggests both competence and truthfulness on his part. Again, Boyd states, "What has also impressed a good number of scholars is the manner in which Luke accurately portrays the political regions, geography, roadways, and various means of travel of the mid-1st century. The frequent and very understandable errors on such matters found in other contemporary historians, such as Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and even Josephus, are almost wholly absent from Luke. For example, Luke correctly identifies Lystra and Derbe as Lycaonian cities, though they were actually located within Phrygia and labeled as such by later writers, and he correctly does not locate Caesarea within Judea, owing presumably to its unique status as a city-state over and against other local regions. In his masterful book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, Colin Hemer canvasses dozens upon dozens of examples of small details which the author of Acts gets right. There are simply too many examples of this across too many categories for us to deny that the author of Acts knew what he was talking about. I cannot cover all of these examples in this video, for to do so would swiftly become tedious. Interested viewers are referred to Hemer's book for a full catalog of these sorts of things, but Hemer rightly concludes, It is revealing that modern scholars have no convincing alternative way of handling the details here. They have to assume that Luke included gratuitously the redactionally irrelevant with no apparent motive beyond a desire for fine writing. This accords ill in itself with the purposive theological Luke we are to seek elsewhere. It is our contention that these inconsequential details are hard to explain except as vivid experiences recalled at no great distance in time. There are also numerous striking correlations between Acts and the letters of Paul the Apostle. For example, Paul is quoted as referring to himself as the chief of sinners, and he uses the same verbiage to refer to himself in his epistles. It might be objected that these sorts of correlations may be explained by the author of Acts having access to Paul's epistles, but in the first place, this response creates tension with one of the most common arguments that the author of Acts cannot have been Luke because of the supposed discrepancies between Acts and the epistles. It cannot both be the case that the author of Acts both carefully copied from the Pauline epistles to make his story believable, and also that he blatantly contradicted the Pauline epistles. Second, this idea fails to explain certain examples of correlations, such as undesigned coincidences, which, as I observed in my video on undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, are casual and so resist explanation by recourse to deliberate redaction. As Hemer says, it may seem odd even to postulate undesigned coincidences when the contradictions of Acts and the epistles are of the common stuff of conventional criticism, but there is a tendency to compare by over-rigid criteria so that many instances of supposed contradiction are as indecisive as the facile harmonizations of apologetic by special pleading. This category requires neither forced harmonization nor forced contradiction, but the natural fitting of independent pieces. In her book Hidden in Plain View, Lydia McGrew details numerous examples of undesigned coincidences between Acts and the epistles of Paul. She concludes that the minute correspondences I have discussed here between Acts and the Pauline epistles make a strong case that Acts is written by someone who knew the Apostle Paul personally. The author appears to have had intimate, accurate knowledge, independent of the epistles, of both Paul's general history and his detailed movements, even sometimes of his intentions. Moreover, the author of Acts was careful and precise, what we would call a detail person. In conclusion, there is an abundance of evidence for the historical reliability of Acts. This video has only scratched the surface. We have seen that there is a good case for Luke the companion of Paul being the author of Acts, for dating the work prior to 70 AD, and for thinking that the author of Acts is truthful in what he reports. As we shall see in a future video, this evidence becomes pertinent to the case for the resurrection of Jesus. As such, it is valuable evidence for the Christian apologist.